Hey, friends. So, I had an insight show up a couple days ago, and it sort of came out of a conversation slash meeting that I had. But it's something that it's when I tell you, it's not a new insight to me, but it's something that becomes relevant when we start to think about, or when we start to implement, or even just articulated desire to learn something new. When we learn something new, this is what's going to show up. As a teacher, it's hard not to become aware that the learning process, at least 50% of it, and in many cases more than 50% of what we call the learning process, really ought to be called the unlearning process. Because learning anything, it's almost impossible for me to think of something that we could learn that would not in some way involve supplanting or modifying or replacing, or at the very least tweaking something that we already know, or in the case of, like a skill or a practice, something that we already do, that our bodies, our minds, our neurological patterns already know how to do. And learning something new means unlearning those patterns. And this showed up it showed up as an insight in an exchange I was having, where it was amply evident that at least a few people in the conversation were less than inclined to modify their own position. In other words, while virtually no one ever says, I don't want to learn anything new, I'm not interested in learning anything new, right? When's the last time that someone forthrightly and unapologetically said that to you? I don't care about learning. Not too many people say that. Most people, we think of ourselves as people who want to learn. And a lot of us pride ourselves on our willingness to learn and our capacity to continue to learn even as we age, even as we may be progressing through various chapters of our life. We like to think that we remain open to new possibilities, that we remain open. It kind of makes us feel young, right? When you're young, learning is not like some high ideal that you choose for yourself. It's just like survival. You're learning constantly because your body and your mind are telling you, you got to learn this, you got to learn this. You're in a world you don't understand. You got to understand this. When we get to adulthood is when we start to kind of settle into some patterns where we kind of feel like, okay, I think I got this. I think I got this life thing down. Most of it, maybe not all of it, but I'm getting a lot of things to kind of where I understand them. We get a little bit of reprieve from that relentless onslaught of learning that we have in youth. But what that means is that we also, if we actually allow this to happen, it's not a foregone conclusion, but it's quite possible that we will allow ourselves to become complacent. And at that point, we fall into what Sadhguru would call compulsion. We start to just do things the way we do them, think thoughts the way we think them, feel feelings the way we feel them, and we don't necessarily feel the urge to change that. And there's a fair amount of research on this. I forget the psychologist's name, or maybe he's a neuroscientist, who calls it efficiencies. The brain actually, when the brain sort of creates a pattern around a certain thing, whether it's a thing we do, a physical thing we do, or our even just our opinion or our perspective on a particular issue or about a particular subject, it develops a pattern which gives us a way of saying, I understand that. I know how to do this. It lets us kind of close the loop on a certain chunk of our experience and feel as though I don't have to think about that anymore. And that means my mind can now do other things. This neuroscientist called that an efficiency. And we have to develop these, or else we'll go insane and we'll never really be able to handle the world. Like if we don't ever close the loop on a certain thing we're thinking about, then it could quite possibly remain active and never leave us alone. Especially if it feels like something that's truly urgent or somehow, relevant to our survival, relevant to our status, relevant to our emotional relationship with another individual. If we can't close those loops, then we're going to be constantly feeling as though we have to keep learning something, keep doing something different, keep trying something, because we don't feel like we can ever kind of put it down. So these efficiencies are not a bad thing. They are, in fact, literally the building blocks of learning. That's how we evolve our learning. The only issue is if we want to change our perspective on something, if we want to change our proficiency at a certain skill. I encounter this in piano all the time. I encounter it in myself, and I encounter it in my students. The only way to do that is to unlearn the way we already do it. Maybe not wholesale. Maybe we don't throw out everything we've learned, probably not. But to some extent, everything has to come up for review. Every little, like if I'm watching somebody play piano and I'm trying to help them, play faster, play smoother, play lighter, play with more power, play with more range, play something more difficult than they've ever tackled before. I'm trying to help them improvise rather than play something that's written out. In any of those cases, I'm going to have to observe what the student is doing now and say, okay, here's what you need to stop doing, and here's what you need to do. And I don't always say it like that. And I'm not even necessarily thinking of it like that when I speak to the student. But on some level, and sometimes I am, if it's like a physical habit that they're doing something with their hand that's counterproductive. It's either adding additional tension into their hand, or it could be almost anything, anything that's habitual and that's sort of going in the opposite direction of where we want to go, or just creating a barrier to going further in the direction that they want to go. I have to, on some level, frustrate that impulse. And this is something that as a teacher you start to become aware of. You start to know and notice when you're frustrating those impulses in a student. And there's different students have way different tolerances for this. Some students, just a little light touch. All I have to do is just almost hint at letting sort of one habitual way go, or like challenge the way that I can tell that they're kind of just compulsively doing something. And that is enough. Like that's kind of all they can take. And it depends on the student. Other students, you can just go right for the jugular over and over and over, and they lap it up. They love it because they just they know that there's things that they can't observe, and they are grateful for the experience of a teacher who can tell them what's going on, because likely they've struggled. They really want to make progress. They want to change. They want to become better at what they're doing. And the barrier to that, they've learned over time that the barrier to that is their own habits. And observing our own habits is one of the hardest things to do. So we have teachers who help us do that, especially teachers who already have are kind of past the point where we are in our development. They know more. They can see evidently what's going on with us. So anyway, this is something that, again, I say this isn't a new insight for me. It's something that I work with regularly, almost every day, anytime I teach, certainly, and also anytime I practice. But I think on the strictly intellectual level, it's really important to acknowledge and understand that learning equals unlearning. And when we kind of get that, I'll speak for myself, but when I can really be present to that knowledge, be aware of that. For one thing, I become gentler with myself. I start to understand why it's hard to learn something new, rather than thinking, when you're presented with something new, a lot of times it kind of seems easier. You watch someone who can do something really well and it looks easy. You listen to someone speak about a topic and they are brilliant and it's easy to understand them. Then you go and try and say the same thing and you're like, wait, when I was listening to them, I was a genius. I was following every thought they had, and it was genius thought, and I was a genius. I understood it all. Now I'm opening my own mouth to speak, and I don't sound so genius, right? So we start to understand the gap between where we actually are and where we're trying to go, and that there's unlearning there that has to be done. And we understand why it's hard, because we know that we're going against some of our own programming. It's like we're getting in there and chopping things up, dissolving patterns that may have worked great at one point, but now it's time for a change. And, in order to get to the next one, we got to break up the one that's here now. But we can have some empathy for ourselves in that process. And we can sort of properly understand what we're really doing, in that we're not just unplugging one appliance and plugging in another one. It takes time for our mind to integrate new information. It's not something that, it kind of depends what we're talking about here in terms of like, if it's like simply learning new data about something that we don't have a very strong opinion about or a strong perspective on, that's usually pretty easy to assimilate. But if information arrives that challenges a deeply held conviction, that challenges a belief that might be tied up with emotion and with some of our early imprinting, our early deep kind of core learning, and when something comes in that kind of shakes the way we see the world, well, now that unlearning process involves, in the most extreme cases, like an identity crisis. Like we're actually going in and tinkering with and revealing as unstable the foundations of what we may have built our identity on, or at least our sense of safety and security, or our sense of meaning. And when you're asking somebody to do that, you're asking them to do a pretty sizable task, right? Now, in my book, that's the best work you can possibly do. Why would you not want to do that work? Once you understand that every set of beliefs, every set of convictions, every set of boundaries to define reality that we create, that ultimately they're all arbitrary in some way, they're not, that does not mean useless. It does not mean not valuable. It doesn't mean even not essential in some ways. And sometimes we're going to do the opposite. We're going to defend those boundaries. But ultimately, they're not real. Ultimately, they are fictions. They're useful fictions. And we can, and if we want to evolve, we need to send them up for review every once in a while and be willing to go all the way to the, go all the way to the core and take a look. Is this real? Is what I believe here really real? And if we can do that process with poise and with presence and with self-care, self-empathy, care for the other, or whoever we may be in dialogue with, if we can really kind of keep in mind what the unlearning process truly involves, I think we navigate it much more gracefully, and we can bring people along with us if that's what we need to do much more easily, because we're appreciating what the work really is. So I'm saying this for myself, obviously. And there's any number of contexts in my life where I think sitting with this realization and kind of keeping it top of mind is going to be helpful in all of the work that I do, whether it's work internally that I'm doing on myself, or in groups, or with my students, or whatever. So I'd be very curious to see what this insight does for you. What does this spark? What is this, does it inspire anything? Does it remind you of anything? Does it show up for you in any way? Is it something that you're like really already kind of well conscious of, and you have a practice around this understanding in some area of your life? I'd love to hear that. Send me a message. Thanks for watching. I appreciate you. Have a great day. I'll see you soon.